Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Maggie, the Incubation and Ecosystem Lead at the Mills Fabrica, and I'm the facilitator for today. And welcome to the Rethink Packaging webinar co-organized by us, the Mills Fabrica, and WGSN. And for those of you who are new to our community, we would like to share a brief background about us. The Mills Fabrica is the innovation arm of the Mills, a revitalization project by the Nafun Group, which is a Hong Kong-based real estate developer. And for us, the Mills Fabrica, we are a go-to solutions platform accelerating textile and agri-food tech innovations for sustainability and social impact. And now we'll move on to our first panel discussion, and we'll talk about bridging the gaps in sustainable packaging through industry collaborations. May we now invite our first panel, Sonalie, the founder and editor-in-chief of QUEEN, and Rik, managing director of Bioeconomy Capital. I'll pass it over to our moderator. Angus, please.
Thank you, Maggie, and good to see you, Sonalie and Rik. And thank you for joining me in this first webinar, where we are going to talk about how we can bridge the gaps in sustainable packaging through industry collaborations. Especially, I know we are both passionate about the alternative bio-based materials, and hopefully we can talk more on this topic today. To begin with, maybe I will first let Sonalie to give us a brief introduction of yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm Sonalie Figueiras. For the last decade, I've been running a media company called QUEEN, as well as doing other things. But in the last 2 years, I've become quite obsessed with everything to do with materials and packaging and plastics. So specifically trying to work towards a world beyond plastics. As in my role as CEO and co-founder at sourcegreenpackaging.com. So we're the first platform in the world that is dedicated to really removing petrochemicals from the packaging supply chain in the form of a marketplace, and actually a tool that we're building to really show people the impact of their plastic packaging on waste. Because I think you can't really speak about packaging and plastics without talking about waste. And honestly, we're in the middle of a global waste crisis, but specifically a global plastic waste crisis.
Thank you, Sonalie. And Rik, may I also have a brief introduction of yourself?
Yes, I'm managing director at Bioeconomy Capital, which is an early stage venture capital firm. The bioeconomy in the name sort of gives it away. We believe that biology is one of the pillar sciences for the 21st century. And it's going to be, we hope it's going to be one of the bases for getting us out of the trouble that we currently face, which is an industrial world that is predominantly built on petroleum as a feedstock. My overall message in the end is going to be optimistic in that I am investing now in solutions that I hope to see come to fruition in 5 to 7 years and really make a difference for packaging and for the world.
Thank you. As we noticed in the video earlier, there are still some challenges when we are trying to deviate from the fossil fuel-based resources and plastics that is being used conventionally in the market. Perhaps to begin with, I want to ask Sonalie, what is bio-based plastic, or what is bioplastics actually? And do you think consumers in general understand plastics correctly?
That's a great question, Angus. And the answer is no, I don't. And I don't think it's just consumers. From our 2 years talking to, at this point, almost 1,000 buyers and suppliers across the world, even in the industry itself, people are confused about what, so you use the term bioplastic, and it's interesting because yesterday I was on a panel at the Rethinking Materials Summit, and I was hosting a roundtable about this exact question. What is a bioplastic? And these were only industry people. and no one could really agree on a definition. And even the word plastic, what is a plastic, right? To some people, plastic extends to being a polymer, right? So anything that's a polymer would qualify, a polymer made from, let's say, petrochemicals. So for a consumer, plastic is associated with fossil fuels to some extent. But the reality is we also use this term bioplastic, where you have a material that is equivalent to plastic, but it's made with non-petrochemical bio-based sources. For example, PLA is very famous, right? Made from cornstarch. But I think the problem is the word plastic versus the word polymer, there is a difference. And I personally think we should start to be more specific around defining something as a polymer, and also kind of using the term flexible or non-flexible, which also has implications in terms of end of life. But to answer your question, people are confused. People are not clear what a bioplastic is. I think bioplastics for a long time have enjoyed a positive association. But in the last couple of years, there have been activists and other campaigns that have made the point that bioplastics are not that different than plastics in how they behave in the supply chain, and therefore can also be problematic. So I think there is this kind of confusion for consumers around, well, we know plastics are bad, but are bioplastics bad? And what should I do with a bioplastic? So there are no easy answers. And the other thing that's very complicated is regulation is different depending on where you go in the world. Here in Asia, we don't have strong regulations around the definitions of plastic. But for example, the EU with their single-use plastic directive has been very, very, taken a very extreme view on what a bioplastic is, and really limited the scope of what they allow as alternatives. So it's complicated. And it really, one thing that's often missing from the discussion is what is the end of life of these materials? And so we need to do a little more around there.
Yeah. Previously, you mentioned one of the feedstock to produce bioplastics. And actually, we also know that there are many also different kinds of feedstock that is being used to produce bioplastics as well. Rik, what's your understanding of bioplastics, and what do you see are some of the challenges for these novel materials?
Yeah, so, first of all, I will second everything that Sonalie just said. The confusion is widespread, even among those in the industry. If I return to, my background is, in physics and electrical engineering as a scientist, a polymer is just a chain of, unit molecules, monomers. And that is value neutral. But when you go to plastics, you're almost always implying that it's a petrochemical feedstock, something like that. I should say, back to the science, nature doesn't care. So we can use biology to fabricate a plastic which is identical to the one produced from a petrochemical feedstock. And unfortunately, it is exactly chemically identical, and it will not break down for thousands of years. So just using biology, it's not enough, which Sonalie was addressing. So if we, let's turn to some of the, more optimistic things. We do have the ability to design polymers that will break down at end of life. Again, if you think of a chain, they're all the same chain link, something like that. Well, what if every fifth link we put in something that was going to break after, a month or something like that? We would have engineered in an end of life strategy for that polymer. So that's, there are some interesting scientific, breakthroughs, not even breakthroughs, it's engineering at this point that we could do. And then, of course, back to feedstocks. problem with a lot of the bio-based solutions right now is that they rely on sugar as the feedstock. Sugar, one, it's quite expensive, and it's food that people around the world actually need. So it's not a great thing to be basing an entire industry on. And the good thing here is that there are a wide variety of, say, bacteria, microbes, and they eat many different things. We don't have to feed them sugar. We can feed them feedstocks, which, for example, just even composting, you're giving organic waste to various bacteria. We could do something similar. That's a feedstock. Waste methane, again, either from landfills or some other source, maybe an industrial source, that's another feedstock. And coming all the way back to the economics, which I think Sonalie has some great stuff to talk about, why bioplastics don't work. It's partially the money. Some of these feedstocks are much cheaper and would allow a head-to-head competition with petrochemicals.
Yeah, and as we are transitioning from using sugar to other kinds of feedstock, what will be some of the examples you two can give us? For example, I know that mushroom, which is also called mycelium, and algae. What are some of the examples that you can let the audience know if they are not familiar with this bioplastic thing?
And who is the question directed at, me or?
Perhaps Rik can answer first.
Okay. Yeah. So there's many different sources, but in general, one class which is interesting is waste, obviously, from many different sources. So one that I mentioned was methane. Methane can come about either from fermentation within existing compost piles or landfills. That's a green version of it. And we would like to use that green version. Otherwise, yes, you can, particularly here in the United States, use fracking to get it. But then it's a petrochemical feedstock, so we wouldn't use that. But the advantage of methane is it's cheap. It's also, honestly, a waste gas from a number of industrial processes. So Mango Materials is a company that's experimented with using industrial flue gas and then building bioplastics based on the methane that's in there. You mentioned mycelium. So, mushrooms or fungi in general are one of the kingdoms of life, along with plants and animals. And their specialty throughout nature is degrading things. So they're an excellent choice because depending on the particular feedstock, whether it's organic waste or something else, we can find a fungi that will feed on it. And of course, they're very cheap to grow. So those are two interesting examples. I have yet one more, which is a portfolio company that domesticates bacteria. And so they actually go out looking. A customer might come to them and say, my industrial process is generating lots and lots of chemical X. Right now, I have to throw it into a landfill. Can you find me something in nature that would eat this and upcycle it into something more valuable? And the interesting thing is that there are 10 to the 7th to 10 to the 9th different species of bacteria. So, there's somebody out there who wants to eat this stuff? So.
Thank you. And Sonalie, any interesting innovators you came across from your platform or from the articles you often post on Green Queen?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are currently dozens, I would say, of really, really strong, innovative startups that are really, really pioneering the future of materials, some of which to be used in fashion and textiles, and some of which to be used in packaging. Algae, mycelium, but we're also seeing a lot of waste-based options, some of which Rik has described. But I do want to take a step back and go back to what you said around, talk about pricing. Our view is that currently plastic is artificially cheap. So the comparisons on price are based on basically a mispricing. Because pricing is not, plastic is not priced to include all the other stuff, like the cost of pollution that happens when you are actually creating plastic, the end of life costs of where plastic ends up, which, by the way, a new report came out yesterday, just in the US, less than 6% of plastics are recycled. The rest either end up in landfill or in incineration, and incineration causes pollution, air pollution, and other toxic gases to be released and cost money. And landfills also cause a host of issues, and that is not properly priced in. So it's our view that if all of that was priced in, and if regulation comes in to make EPR laws, where it's extended producer responsibility laws, so basically you as the brand or the manufacturer are in charge of the cost of end of life of your product, which includes your packaging, then suddenly plastic will not look so cheap. And some of these other materials will start to look more interesting. And frankly, they should have subsidies geared towards them, because we need to get to a point where single use or short-term use packaging is made from renewable, waste-based materials that degrade in a very natural manner, that do not require an industrial facility to degrade, and that do not release toxins or microplastics when they degrade. But the reality is, while there are some really exciting solutions out there, and there really are, I think we're a couple of years out from those being commercially scalable. And you can see that with things like PHA. There's a lot of great pilots, but we're not there yet. However, on the algae front, I think we could get there faster. There's also a lot of interesting, a lot of packaging requires coatings in order to, be grease-proof or waterproof or what have you. And there's a lot of interesting technology happening around better coatings, because today a lot of the coatings do contain toxins and petrochemicals, neither of which are good for human health, wildlife health, or renewable. So I think it's really important to look at things in a much broader sense. And while it is great to get excited about all the new materials, we really need to divert resources to these innovators. And so that, like, one of the things that we do is, like, we also introduce them to bigger players in order for them to have more pilots, because honestly, everything we've seen, and we've spoken to almost everyone in the world in terms of new materials, is that they're still very early. So we need to go faster. But what's happening now is that a lot of resources are going into this recycling plastic circularity myth. And so you have subsidies and grants and even lots of VC dollars that are going into supporting essentially what is the future of the oil industry, AKA the petrochemical plastic industry. And instead, we need to divert. So I don't want to leave this panel without a focus on systems change.
Right. I mean, well, go ahead, Angus. How are we doing on time in our segment?
Yeah, final question, and we will open the floor up to the audience. Given some of the new policies that target plastic pollution that emerged recently around the globe, for example, in the UK, they have pass a plastic packaging test that is coming into effect in this year. And in China, they also laid out a 5-year plan to ban the use of plastic products. Given these new regulations, what would you expect to see in the field of packaging in the future?
I'm unfortunately pessimistic on regulation. At least, again, where I sit in the United States, given the strength of the petrochemical lobby. The need, as Sonalie said, is there. The fact that, as economists would call it, an externality, we are not pricing in any of the negative effects of plastics, and therefore it's impossible for alternatives to compete. So I would like to see more than just taxes. That's, raising the price is an incentive, but what if the incentive is not enough? How much behavior is actually changed? If you're rich in one of the first world countries, changing the price of a bag from 5 cents to 10 cents is still not material. It's not going to change your behavior. So in that respect, I'm actually more pro straight regulation, say a ban on single-use plastics.
Agree, Rick. I agree. When I say regulation, I also mean just stopping. That's a bigger conversation. There's stopping the subsidies. There's being regulated on also toxicity and health related effects, which is starting to come out more and more. We're just at the beginning of our journey of understanding what microplastic pollution and plastic pollution production has done to human health. And frankly, I'm not pessimistic. I'm pessimistic on regulation based on the environment. We don't seem to be very good at that, but we certainly do care if our children are not breathing properly, or if we're not able to have babies because of plastics in our environment. So that is coming. And many countries in the world that use a ton of plastic have fertility rate issues, namely the US and to some extent, and Europe, and then of course China. And I think that when that link becomes stronger and stronger, governments will act for those reasons, more than just to protect the environment, which unfortunately doesn't seem to ever be enough of a motivation for us to change laws and subsidies. But it's a bigger subject than just, as Rick says, putting a tax. But I do think that the more expensive it becomes for municipalities to deal with waste, the more likely that EPR laws will be implemented in terms of that side of things. And then the other thing that's really positive is that there's a ton of new consumer research that shows that the younger generations are more and more willing to pay a little more for products, and they're more and more demanding products that are plastic free. So it will become harder and harder to sell plastic and plastic packaging. But again, 5-10 years out of truly, Gen Z is only now reaching adulthood. So we've got another 10 years of Gen Z to start becoming workers and being able to spend their own money in meaningful ways. Right, Rick?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm really, that does make me optimistic when I actually talk to younger people. I mean, they get it. They only have one planet and this is their future. And so they are adopting a different attitude. And I think that's wonderful. And again, on the hopeful elements, that's my job. I mean, I'm investing today for results again, 5 years out. And I'm super excited about the things that I'm doing, today. because it's going to make a difference. So we have this gap that we've got to get through. But then I see a brighter future.
Thank you. And we have some questions from the audience already. The first question would be, what are the end-of-life initiatives seen in APAC? And any systemic infrastructure investment that has been done to your knowledge? And as the audience see some big traction like TerraCycle Loop in the USA and Europe with some of the Fortune 500 brands. Anyone would like to take this one?
I think that was Sonalie, right? It was infrastructure in APAC region.
Yeah, there's very little infrastructure in APAC for all kinds of end of life. So we lack recycling infrastructure, we lack composting infrastructure. We tend to, governments in Asia tend to invest in incineration when they can, but the reality is that Asia suffers the most from mismanaged dumps or illegal dumps, and of course from overflowing landfill. So that's, I mean, honestly, there isn't like a positive spin on that. And I can tell you something interesting. Japan is a place where if you visit Japan, you might think they're really, really good at recycling because there are recycling bins everywhere. And it's by all accounts a very clean country with very little trash. But we're doing some numbers, and actually something like 60% of that ends up incinerated. So even though it's being collected as recycling, so there's this big gap between collection point and then what's actually happening. And that's another thing that I think is very misunderstood from a public. Oh, somebody said, yes, live in Japan, and that needs to be said. Thank you. Yes, it's amazing how much people seem to think Japan recycles everything. Not at all. And the reality is that's because so many types of plastic cannot be recycled. So it's really important to keep that in mind. So it's not a great answer for APAC infrastructure. I mean, here in Hong Kong, our landfills are close to full. And the reality is that the government has chosen to build a huge incinerator. And I mean, this panel is too short to go into all the issues that are related to the problem of incinerating our waste.
Yeah, this is a very broad topic, and this is our conversation today is just a beginning for us to dive deep into the topic more. So I will ask one final question from the audience. James has cited an article from Guardian saying that microplastics have now been found in human blood for the first time. So because of this, isn't this enough for us to really do something about the plastics problem at the moment? Yeah. False.
You would think so. You know, I don't know at what point outrage and also self-interest, as Sonalie says, it's our health, when that kicks in. You know, the environmental movement in the US didn't really begin until the 1970s. After about 100 years of rapid and extensive industrialization. So I don't know when it starts. I mean, I do think, I don't know if this is optimistic or pessimistic, but in nature, everything is circular. You know, if there is a resource, nature will use it. So it's interesting that in 2016, a bug was discovered in a Japanese landfill, of all places, that eats plastic. Not very well, not yet, but it eats plastic. And why is that? Because we have accumulated so much of it. And there was an interesting report in December of 2021, so not that long ago, that expanded that. They did genomic sampling in many different locations, and they found many different bacteria that had adapted and were now able to eat plastics. So in the end, nature will work out a solution for this, but it's slow and we may all be dead by then. So we should do something ourselves.
Yes.
Thank you, Sonalie and Rik, for your insightful sharing.